I've got some qualities here written down that I'm feeling, some emotions that I've felt throughout the day today, Mark, and I'll share that with some of the people. And yes, if I'm hyperbolic with some of these words, these terms, that's fine. But the number one word that I came up with when I first heard the news that Brian Ferentz had been moved to the quarterback position, along with being offensive coordinator, was disillusioned. I've become disillusioned. Hopefully that's temporary because I love the Hawks, but right now I'm disillusioned. Disappointed is number 2 on my list, Mark. Dismayed is 3. Disheartened comes in 4th place. Discouraged comes in 5th. I'm not to distraught yet. I'm not yet to distraught. I hope I don't get to that point. I think if you get distraught, you're probably taking sports too seriously. But all the other qualities ring true. I am, like I said, how many hours now since that news broke from Pete Thamel of ESPN, and I'm just disappointed. I mean, that would be the one word that I don't want to. That's the one word that perfectly sums up how I'm feeling. There are some people out there that are, I guess, happy that Brian Ferentz has been moved to that position. We can all be hopeful, Mark. We can hope that it works out. We can hope that Brian Ferentz will make a big difference with quarterback play, and I sure hope he does. I really do. I want him to succeed. But the bottom line is, there's no reason, at least for me, to have any sort of confidence that this move is going to make. Now, the Abdul Hodge news, I've gotten ripped today because I was somewhat critical of that hire. I wasn't overly critical. I just said, look, he's never coached tight ends. Mark, he was a linebacker at Iowa and a linebacker in the NFL, and a darn good one. But he's never coached tight ends that I'm aware of, unless he coached at the high school level. He most recently was at South Dakota as an outside linebackers coach. I have no problem bringing him on. It should help with the diversity and inclusion issues, having another black coach on staff. And again, Abdul Hodge. I met Abdul Hodge when I was young, and he was very nice to me. It was at a spring game, and that kind of stuck with me over the years. So I've got a lot of respect for Abdul Hodge. I have no question that he's, going to be successful. I mean, I don't know if his future is as a tight ends coach, but that's how he's getting on the staff initially, and maybe he'll succeed. I'm not saying he can't. I am I question it though, and I think it's okay to question that, even about somebody who we know to be a good person and maybe a good coach. Brian, I've even made the statement about Brian, Mark, that I think Brian would probably be a good tight ends coach here. He looked like a pretty good tight ends coach briefly in the NFL when he was with the Patriots. But again, going back to Brian Ferentz being the quarterback's coach, what reason do we have to believe that he is qualified to be the quarterback's coach, Mark? He's never coached quarterbacks. He's never played quarterbacks. Why is he coaching quarterbacks? Just explain it to me.
So when I first heard the news, it was out of your mouth. It was so if you can't get enough of this story, we're certainly going to cover it here for the next 60 minutes. But I would advise and encourage everyone to head on over to From the Hawkeye of the Storm. Corey went live for 60 minutes, 90 minutes?
Yeah, about 90.
A couple hours earlier today, and took phone calls. So that was quite interesting, riveting at times. And so I would encourage you to head on over there and check out Corey's work this afternoon, and the tremendous feedback that we received from all of you concerning the moves that were made. So, wow, this speaks of, I hate to use the word, it's a word that's used many times in the chat, nepotism. It also speaks of possible, nepotism is a strong word in and of itself, but in regards to just going an easy route to fill a role, and also a bit of, again, I don't know that this is the exact word I'm looking for, but a bit of laziness to fill the role, and not going through various avenues to see who would be the best fit out there, who would be the best qualified. I chuckled when I saw the news because I thought, why didn't I think of that? I know that you had and mentioned it to Coach Tom Patterson during one of your shows, but I didn't think of it. Now, I didn't, leaning on you for our Iowa football expertise, I got to tell you, I didn't give I didn't know who the candidates were other than from our conversation, give it much thought whatsoever. Had I given it maybe a couple minutes of thought, based on how business is done there, it doesn't surprise me. And I should have guessed.
And how is business done there, Mark? Tell us.
I just think there's a conservative approach. And I don't say that conservative, that can be taken, certainly depending on the situation and what the situation calls for, can be a wise way to go, but it can also be a very restricting way to go. But a conservative approach to say we're going to keep this in-house, we're going to keep it with people we know, whether those people are family members or just longtime connections within the culture, within the staff. I think it's good to have a core of that, but if you don't frequently go outside the walls of the football program to bring in fresh blood, new ideas, fresh approach, new energy, I think you can become complacent. This is a program that on the conservative side has sown and therefore reaped stability and consistency. But also on the downside, we see a stale offense from year to year, and we see a lack of ingenuity and creativity on that side of the ball, and we see similar results, which are mundane and pedestrian.
I said last week, Mark, that there is a narrative with the fans at times that they believe Kirk takes the easy way out with hires. And having Brian Ferentz come work for him, having his son-in-law work for him, bringing Ken O'Keefe back from the NFL to be quarterback's coach, and then this one. I'm not saying I always agree with that. As you know, Mark, I do have a lot of respect. I've always had a lot of respect for Kirk Ferentz. I think he does things the right way. I think he's a really good human being. But I think his judgment's being clouded by his children right now, specifically his son, Brian. And I'm not saying it's even Brian's fault. This is on Kirk, and it's on Gary Barta as the AD. And I'll give you an example. I can see the scenario playing out. So Iowa goes into 2022, and Iowa's offensive passing attack becomes better. Say we get up to, from 120 in the country by some metrics to 100. Which is an improvement, but still pretty darn bad, Mark. But I can just hear the haters or the naysayers or the defenders of Brian and Kirk coming forward and saying, we told you so. This was the solution. See, we're trending in the right direction. And I guess what I would say to that, Mark, is two things. You can't get much worse than they were last year, okay? That's just a fact. So I think it would be hard for anybody who's coming in there to take over that position to go backwards and to continue falling in the rankings because they're near the bottom of the FBS right now. So logic would tell you, common sense would tell you, whoever's in there is going to improve somewhat. They don't need a somewhat improvement. They need a pretty substantial improvement just to get up to average, which is all they need. They need to get up to average. Second thing I'll say on this is perhaps it works, and I hope it does. I hope it does. But it would be like, Mark, you and I are walking downtown New York at midnight, all right? And we're heading for a restaurant. I don't know what restaurants are open at midnight, but we're heading downtown New York at midnight, and you decide you're going to cut through a dark alley, all right? Because it's a shortcut to the restaurant. And I say, no, I'm going to go around the lit way. I may get there later. I may be hungry by the time I get there, but I'm going to go around the long way. You may make it through that dark alley unscathed. And you may look at me when I get to the restaurant and say, I told you so, I'm done eating my food. But here's the deal, Mark. That doesn't mean it was a good decision, all right? It does not mean it was a good decision. And I think the probabilities of this not working out, as opposed to you walking through a dark alley, are much higher. So that's all I'll say. To me, what it looks like from the outside is that Kirk is putting all his chips on this move, just hoping that Brian can do it. He's giving Brian everything he can possibly give him. He's giving him the entire offense, and now he's giving him the quarterback coaching position. which are two very, very important responsibilities. And it's ride or die. And I don't, maybe it'll work. I don't have reason to believe it will, but I don't believe it's fair to the program or the fan base, Mark, because to me, he's betting the fan base. He's betting the program. You can look at the program as a pile of poker chips. He's putting all those chips in the middle of the table, hoping that he rolls snake eyes. And that's frustrating to me because Kirk has given a lot to the program, but the program's given him a lot. And this is as critical as I've ever been of Kirk Ferentz, Mark. You know this. I mean, we've been doing shows here for, what, a year now? This is as critical as I've ever been of Kirk Ferentz directly. I've been critical of Ken and Brian at times. I am disturbed by this move today. I hope it ends up working out. But, man, to look at this from a reasonable standpoint and say that promoting Brian Ferentz as quarterback's coach was the best move they could make, to me, appears to be absurd. And it's nothing personal towards Brian or Kirk. We're just talking credentials.
And the offense was so poor statistically last year, to your point. Anyone who the odds say that as long as you run plays, you run reasonable concepts, both in the passing game and the running game, that you have more, meaning Iowa has more talent than, even on offense, than 75 or 80% of the country, that if you just run your offense, it's almost impossible statistically to get worse. So, UConn, UMass, et cetera, on down the line are continue to be abysmal because they have the worst talent in the country. So Iowa could raise its level of offensive production by 25 spots, and that's still not what they should be striving for. It's still not a success.
Right. And like I said, chances are anybody who's back there will improve somewhat, because you literally cannot be much worse. And if they're much worse, I mean, you know how great that defensive unit was, and you know how great special teams were for Iowa last year. We've talked about the schedule and how much more difficult it gets. Now, here's the other wild card that still is out there. We need to at least acknowledge the fact that the Raiders' tight end position has presumably not been filled yet. So could we speculate and say that this move was made with the idea from Kirk that Brian is actually headed out the door, and that way the move is already made and they can go hire an OC/QB's coach? Because that's typically what we've talked about that with the exception of a few like Lincoln Riley, who's a head coach and QB's position coach. Typically, you have your offensive coordinator also coaching quarterbacks. So is it possible that Kirk has an idea that Brian is going to get hired somewhere, and this move is just setting up a bigger move after that? I suppose, but that would be surprising. And here's the other part of this. Pete Thamel reported this initially. He said his sources that were anonymous were reporting that Brian Ferentz is being elevated to quarterbacks coach, and then of course Abdul Hodge is taking the tight ends coach position. Chad Leistico of the Des Moines Register, through his independent sources, as he stated, told him that there was going to be a formal announcement from the university this afternoon. Well, it's almost 5 o'clock. I have not heard anything, Mark. Nothing official. Well, I actually just got an email as I was saying that. No, nothing. So unless I'm missing something, and I'm on the university's press release list, I have not gotten anything. Now, I could also see this be a situation if the sources that Leistico was using were not Kirk Ferentz himself, and I don't know if they were or not, but if they were not, I could see Kirk waiting a while before announcing it, just to kind of go against the grain a bit. But I expect Pete Thamel to be very, very. He's not going to report something that doesn't have substance, and but again, the other part of this, Mark, is if that was reasonable to think that Kirk is actually just promoting Brian to QB's coach slash OC as a stopgap on a temporary basis until he gets hired at Oakland. My question is, why would you even make that move now? Why not? I mean, like, is Abdul Hodge such a hot commodity that you have to hire him right now? Like, if you're going to do that, why wouldn't you just wait until Brian takes the job? and then you can hire Abdul Hodge at the same time as you hire whoever else, or just hire him right after Brian leaves. So that would tell me the fact that they are making this move now when I don't know that they would have to, because I don't think Abdul Hodge is probably going anywhere else. That would tell me that notion is probably false. That's probably not happening. But I will still, I think a lot of fans will still remain hopeful about potentially, because I've never actually, I don't know that I've ever said on this show, Brian needs to be fired. I don't know that I've ever said that to anybody. But the fact of the matter is, he is not pleasing the fan base. He's not getting it done on the field as of right now. And now he's taking over a position that has struggled under a quarterbacks coach in Ken O'Keefe, who's coached quarterbacks for decades. And so there's going to be fans who are hopeful that he still leaves that tight ends job. And until that tight ends job with Las Vegas, I keep wanting to say Oakland, with Las Vegas gets filled, I'm going to still be closely monitoring that because I always think there's a chance.
So I'm not understanding, unless I'm missing something, so you're going to have to explain this, the approach or the strategy of naming him offensive coordinator if you know he's leaving.
Naming him QB's coach, you mean?
Or QB's coach, yes.
Well,
he was offensive coordinator.
He was the OC and tight ends coach. So I guess what I'm saying is the replacement for Brian Ferentz is probably going to want to coach the offense and quarterbacks. So by hiring a tight ends coach now and saying we're just moving Brian Ferentz to the quarterback position, that would open the door when Brian decides to leave, when he gets hired in the NFL. It would potentially open the door for a bigger name to come in here. And there's no confusion that he's coaching quarterbacks in OC, which is what Brian Ferentz had presumably been promoted to do, if that makes sense. I'm not saying it's sound reasoning or logic. I'm just saying, is there a chance that's what's happening here?
If I'm running the show, and whether I know that he's leaving or not, I don't see the harm in just naming the roles as what they are going to be, meaning that Abdul Hodge is hired and you relieve Ferentz of the tight ends position, give that to Hodge, and you already had a designated quarterbacks coach, and lead people to believe that you're going to hire a quarterbacks coach.
Well, yeah, let's remember this too. The Iowa athletic department isn't always very good with PR. So like Gary Barta, it's been a disaster with PR since he's been here. We've talked about that on the show as well, whether it be extending Fran McCaffrey in the middle of losing to terrible, one of his worst seasons since his first year here. The incident with Gary Dolphin and his suspension. I won't get into that. That was controversial. You have the Jane Meyer situation with field hockey. I mean, you go down the list. So I'm not saying it's smart, but a lot of things that I've seen the Iowa athletic department do from a hiring and personnel standpoint hasn't made much sense. And I'm just saying, regardless of the reason, Iowa fans, I think, should still be somewhat intrigued by who gets hired at Las Vegas, because those rumors were, I think those rumors were legit, that Brian was looking at leaving. I don't think those, where there's smoke, there's fire. And I think there was some fire there. Doesn't mean he's going to get hired, and doesn't mean that plans haven't changed. It doesn't mean that he's decided to stay or he realized he can't go to the league. But until that position under Josh McDaniels gets filled, that's the only position besides assistant special teams coach, I believe, with Oakland that has not been filled yet. So I would anticipate it's going to be filled soon. My understanding is that Andrew Peltzner, I believe is his name, tight ends coach for Cleveland, had been interviewed for the OC job. Then he was rumored to be interviewed for the tight ends job once the Raiders OC job got taken. He has been promoted to QB's coach at Cleveland. So I'm assuming he's off the board for Oakland at their tight end coach position. So I don't know. Let's just see what happens.